Good morning and welcome to Rising. We've got another great show for you today. Lots of exciting news to get to. Take it away, Jess.
Yes, Republicans are trying out a new attack line on Kamala Harris's running mate, Governor Tim Walz, accusing him of stolen valor. Here's Trump's running mate, JD Vance, talking about what really bothers him about Waltz. Let's watch.
When the United States Marine Corps, when the United States of America asked me to go to Iraq to serve my country, I did it. I did what they asked me to do it, and I did it honorably, and I'm very proud of that service. When Tim Walz was asked by his country to go to Iraq, you know what he did? He dropped out of the Army and allowed his unit to go without him, a fact that he's been criticized for aggressively by a lot of the people that he served with. I think it's shameful to prepare your unit to go to Iraq, to make a promise that you're going to follow through, and then to drop out right before you actually have to go. I also think it's dishonest. Something, again, if you guys ever get an opportunity to ask Tim Walz or Kamala Harris some questions, he made this interesting comment that the Kamala Harris campaign put out there, and I bet they're regretting they put it out there now, because he said that and he was making a point about gun control, he said we shouldn't allow weapons that I used in war to be on America's streets. Well, I wonder, Tim Walz, when were you ever in war? What was this weapon that you carried into war, given that you abandoned your unit right before they went to Iraq, and he has not spent a day in a combat zone? What bothers me about Tim Walz is the stolen valor garbage. Do not pretend to be something that you're not.
That's one of the most serious allegations we've seen in this campaign. It's against federal law to lie about military service to try to defraud people. For context, Waltz retired from the National Guard after 24 years in service. As the crisis in Iraq was growing, Waltz had earned the highest enlisted rank for his unit, but he was an outspoken critic of the war. So Waltz retired from service so that he could run for office. He successfully flipped a Minnesota House seat from red to blue, and Waltz's former unit ended up being deployed 2 months after Waltz retired. Facts matter, but words can stick, so let's remember the Swift Boat campaign attack against then-Senator John Kerry, who was reaching for the Oval Office. Kerry, who served in Vietnam, became a vocal critic. A bunch of veterans devised a campaign against him around his service in a Swift boat. The smear was enough to not only prevent him from victory, it was an effective smear, but it's become a part of the political vocabulary now. And it's worth noting that one of those Vietnam veterans, Chris LaCivitka, who led the Swift Boat campaign, is now a senior advisor to the Trump campaign.
Well, the problem for Waltz, as I see it, is that he's been talking about his service in a way that is perhaps dishonest. In a clip shared by the Harris campaign, Waltz told an audience in 2018 that he carried guns in war when there's no evidence Waltz engaged in active combat. Let's watch.
I spent 25 years in the Army, and I hunt. And I gave the money back, and I'll tell you what I have been doing. I've been voting for common sense legislation that protects the Second Amendment, but we can do background checks. We can do CDC research. We can make sure we don't have reciprocal carry among states, and we can make sure that those weapons of war that I carried in war is the only place where those weapons are at.
And it's not just Republicans. Even CNN has a problem with Walz's choice of words. Here's CNN correspondent Tom Foreman. Let's watch.
Waltz did make a comment, speaking to a group, he's done it a couple of times, where he has used language that has suggested that he carried weapons in a fighting situation. As you know, with your contact with the military, I know from coming from a military family, there is a difference between being in a combat area, being involved at a time of war, and actually being in a position where people are shooting at you. There is no evidence that at any time Governor Waltz was in a position of being shot at, and some of his language could easily be seen to suggest that he was. So that is absolutely false.
Harris and Waltz have tried to quash the accusations and released a statement saying, quote, in his 24 years of service, the governor carried, fired, and trained others to use weapons of war innumerable times. Governor Waltz would never insult or undermine any American's service to the country. In fact, he thanks Senator Vance for putting his life on the line for our country. It's the American way.
Now, I think that it's important to note a few things. I want us to be very clear about the timeline here. So in February 2005, Waltz filed paperwork to run for Congress. Then in March 2005, the Guard announced possible deployment to Iraq within 2 years. In May of 2005, Waltz retired from the National Guard. In July of 2005, that is when Waltz's former unit received deployment orders. And in March 2006, his former unit deployed. Now, Waltz was born in 1964 when he retired from the National Guard. He was 41 years old. Now, I do think it's a bit silly that we only call it a war if war is officially declared when the United States is in combat zones all across the country. I think many people would say where the United States is involved in combat zones, in operations in Afghanistan and across the Middle East, many people would call that war, that there's violence there, that the U.S. military is there, and they're conducting an operation. So him saying, I carried a weapon in war, I don't think a lot of people would split hairs in the way Republicans are trying to.
Well, I don't think, in fairness, I don't think that's the issue here. Well, yes, we've been involved in conflicts that are undeclared wars, and we should call them wars. Sure, that's not really what's being scrutinized here is him saying in war, which implying in combat, seeing action in some fighting theater.
During his time in service.
But he was not deployed to he did not see combat. He did not see action, which is a specific terminology. He was not engaged in, he trained other people to use weapons who used those in active combat, but he was not in combat himself, which is fine. You can obviously serve our country. His
statement's false, though. His statement was,
the statement
I
is an
carried a weapon
exaggeration.
in war.
No.
He was deployed, he carried a weapon there.
I think, I'm not going to make a mountain out of molehill. I'm not going to say this is the biggest deal ever in the world, and maybe Republicans are trying to make a bigger deal of it than it is. And I'm sure we can find plenty of examples going the other way of people, of Republicans. I'm sure other Democrats, of everyone. It is common for political figures to exaggerate the level of danger they were in, not even when they served, but when they took trips to the Middle East. Hillary Clinton did that. Journalists have done that. It's a very common thing. Tim Walz has, in my view, exaggerated his involvement in combat. He has suggested that he was that he exchanged fire, that he was in combat.
When did he say
When
that?
he said that he was in war.
No.
And made a reference to carrying guns in that war, to using the guns. He didn't do that, so it was an exaggeration, and he shouldn't have said it. I don't think it's the biggest deal ever, but I think it's a clear exaggeration.
He was deployed during the U.S. war in Afghanistan, and he carries a weapon as someone who is deployed as a command sergeant major. That is his official post. His statement was true, and his statement was about gun control. He said, we can make sure that those weapons of war that I carried in war, the United States was at war. He was deployed during Afghanistan, not Iraq, Afghanistan. And he said, it's the only place where those weapons are at. He wants to make sure of that. I think that's very reasonable to say. And to say that this is dishonest when he was serving in the National Guard before he retired. He
retired right before he would have been sent to Iraq. I think that is probably the more serious accusation.
He was 41 years old, so he would not have seen combat anyway. He filed paperwork in February of 2005. And in March of 2005, he said that he was willing to go overseas. He was willing to be in Iraq. He said, I would rather...
He said that, but then he did not make that choice.
So let me finish my point. He said, I'm fortunate enough to have a strong group of enthusiastic supporters and a very dedicated and intelligent wife. Both will be a major part of my campaign. Whether I'm in Minnesota or Iraq, I'm dedicated to serving my country to the best of my ability, whether it is in Washington, D.C. or Iraq. Now, months later, before his unit deployed, he said that he got advice that because he was against the war in Iraq and was a vocal opponent to it, and because he was actively campaigning, he could violate the Hatch Act. And that's why he decided to retire. He wouldn't have seen combat at 41 anyway.
Mainstream reporting suggests that he knew that his unit was going to get called up, and he decided to retire.
And that's wrong. That's not the actual timeline.
That is... They weren't called up until after he retired, but he had an inkling that they were going to be called up.
No. He filed paperwork with the FEC to run in February 2005. This was before the Guard even announced possible deployment. This is reporting from the National Guard in Minnesota, from his unit. March of 2005 was the first time they even knew of possible deployment.
He'd already decided to run, but he could have run and continued to serve. Look, people can make whatever they want of the facts. His unit got sent to Iraq, and he got out of it because he decided to run for Congress. You're right, he was not going to be in active combat. That's exactly what happened.
No, his unit was deployed after he decided to run for Congress. He decided to run for Congress. The FEC paperwork shows February 2005. His unit didn't even know there was potential they would be deployed until March 2005, and they were not deployed until a year later in March 2006.
But he knew they were going to be deployed and then decided to retire.
No,
he'd already decided to run for Congress.
They announced a possible deployment within 2 years after he
That's what I said.
his campaign.
He knew there was a possibility, a strong possibility of being deployed, and thus decided to get out of it. At the time where he got out of it, where he retired, he knew that unit, with a high likelihood, would be going to Iraq.
He decided to retire because he was told he could violate the Hatch Act by running for public office and being against the war while serving.
That sounds like a convenient
The
excuse.
Hatch Act limits political activities of federal employees, which he was as a command sergeant major.
That sounds like a very convenient excuse to me. People can make whatever they want of it, but the fact remains that the people he served with in that unit, they got sent to Iraq, and he didn't.
I think it's
because
really,
he went to Congress.
It's really rich that the right wing, the conservatives in the country who really
JD Vance went to Iraq.
Supposedly respect service, yeah, but he hasn't served for 24 years like Tim Walz has.
Okay.
And he's not a high-ranking officer like Tim Walz is. A command sergeant major is one of the most respected positions in the U.S. military, and someone who served for 24 years being told they have stolen valor is ridiculous coming from these people who
some people are going to find it are going to have more
serve.
respect for the person who actually went to Iraq. That's all I'm saying.
I have respect for someone who gave 24 years of their life to public service in the National Guard and is a command sergeant major. Just because he didn't get deployed during the Iraq War and actually was one of those people who said, maybe we shouldn't start never-ending wars in the Middle East. I think people respect and appreciate that perspective more. He's much older than JD Vance and much more experienced than JD Vance, and I think that's why he's going to be a better vice president than JD Vance.
All right, you tell us what you think. We'll have more Rising right after this.